You better be fast. All righty, I'm not positive, but I think our 10 minutes is about up, so maybe we can get started. I do have a handout floating around here. I think Jeff's got a few, Tim's got a few. If you haven't gotten one, wave at them. We're going to be in Matthew chapter 15 today, and kind of flipping back and forth between there and Mark chapter 8. It's not on? Yeah, it's on. I must not be talking loud enough. I don't know. I'll move it up a little higher. Maybe that'll help. Yeah, I think Dave's already headed out, so that's all right. We'll get the doors closed, and that'll help too. Sounds like I'm getting louder, doesn't it? Yeah, I think that's because of background noise. All righty. So we're in Matthew chapter 15. I'm going to read verses 29 through 39. Departing from there, Jesus went along the Sea of Galilee, and having gone up on the mountain, he was sitting there. And large crowds came to him, bringing with them those who were lame, crippled, blind, mute, and many others, and they laid them down at his feet, and he healed them. So the crowd marveled as they saw the mute speaking, the crippled restored, the lame walking, the blind seeing, and they glorified the God of Israel. And Jesus called his disciples to him, and he said, I feel compassion for the people, because they have remained with me now 3 days and have nothing to eat. And I do not want to send them away hungry, for they might faint on the way. The disciples said to him, Where would we get so many loaves in this desolate place to satisfy such a large crowd? And Jesus said to them, How many loaves do you have? And they said, 7, and a few small fish. And he directed the people to sit on the ground. And he took 7 loaves and the fish, and gave thanks, and he broke them and started giving them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the people. And they all ate and were satisfied, and they picked up what was left over of the broken pieces, 7 large baskets full. And those who ate were 4,000 men, besides women and children. And sending away the crowds, Jesus got into the boat and came to the region of Magadan. So, we had Jesus last week in the region of Tyre and Sidon, which was a decidedly Gentile region. But he leaves there, and Matthew's account says that he goes along the Sea of Galilee. But Mark 7:31 says that he left the vicinity of Tyre and Sidon, went to the Sea of Galilee to the region of Decapolis. So if you look at the Sea of Galilee, Decapolis is a region that is on the southeastern or east-southeastern portion of the Sea of Galilee. It's a region of 10 cities, hence the name Decapolis. Decapolis means 10 cities. It applied to those 10 cities and the region where they were located. It was a region that after Rome had taken over Syria, they rebuilt that region. And they allowed them some independence. They minted their own coins. They elected their own government. They even maintained their own armies. So they had quite a bit of freedom as far as the Romans were concerned. A lot more than most places had. Had their own court system too, but it was primarily a Gentile region. So he left a decidedly Gentile region with Tyre and Sidon. He's come back closer to home, but he is in a Gentile region again. He went up on the mountainside and sat down, and mountain, the word that's mountain there is oros, and it could probably more literally be titled hill. So he went on the hill and sat down, or he went up on the mountain and he sat down. And for the Jewish kind of deal, the instructor sat, as opposed to what we're doing right now, where the guy that's quote unquote teaching is standing. For the Jews, the teacher would sit, the pupils would stand. We could try that. It's a lot harder to fall asleep, when you're standing up. So we could kind of reverse that. I could sit, and you guys could stand around me, and that would work, yeah. But anyway, his sitting down indicated that he was ready to teach. And teach he will do. But Mark inserts something here that Matthew doesn't, and I really think it's the thing that sets this whole process into motion. In Mark chapter 7, verse 32, there are some people brought to him a man who was deaf and could hardly talk, and they begged him to place his hand on the man. Jesus took him aside, away from the crowd. He put his fingers into his ears. Then he spit and touched the man's tongue. Now, I don't know about you, but that's kind of a bizarre way to heal somebody when you know Jesus doesn't need to do that. He can speak and the word is done. Anyway, he looks up to heaven and with a deep sigh said to him, Ephphatha, which means be opened. At this, the man's ears were opened, his tongue was loosed, and he began to speak plainly. Jesus commanded them not to tell anyone, but the more he did so, the more they kept talking about it. People were overwhelmed with amazement. He has done everything well, they said. He even makes the deaf hear and the mute to speak. If you remember the woman in John chapter 4, where Jesus was walking through Samaria, he stops at a well, he sends his disciples into town to get food, and there's a woman that comes to the well, and he begins talking to her. And he so enthralls her by what he has to say that she runs into town and tells everybody in town, you need to come out and meet this guy who's told me everything that I ever did. And so before long, most of the town is out there with Jesus, and Jesus is speaking to them. They even prevail on Jesus to stick around a few days. I think that's what happened here. I think it started off with one guy that heard that Jesus is here. His family or friends, family and or friends, brings him to Jesus, asking him to put his hands on this man and heal him. One commentator said they felt like the reason Jesus does all this, with his hands, is that the guy couldn't hear him. And so by his placing hands on him, he realized that Jesus was actually going to do something for him. I don't know if that's the case or not, but it's still kind of a bizarre way to heal somebody. But I think this is the one that sets it in motion, because after he is healed, he tells this man, and he tells his friends, he tells his family, don't tell anybody. And of course, Jesus has done that. I gave you a few verses, he's done that several times. And oftentimes, the people don't listen. They go ahead and say it anyway. I don't get the idea here that this individual did. It says Jesus commanded them not to tell anybody, and they kept on talking about it. So I'm not sure if he's included in the they, or if this is just his friends and his family that are going out and spreading the word. But everybody is hearing about it. Then I think you get to where Matthew is, where there is a crowd of people, and they are coming with all folks who have a blindness, or they're mute, or they're lame, or they're maimed, any kind of problem whatsoever. They're bringing these people, it says, and laying them at Jesus' feet. And Jesus, it says, heals them. No matter what the difficulty, he healed them. He was compassionate on the crowd. He healed all kinds of sicknesses, all kinds of diseases, even demon possession. Nothing was too great for him. Nothing was out of bounds for him. And so what happens, the people then, not only are they amazed by what he does, but they praise the God of Israel. This kind of indicates too, I think, that it is a primarily Gentile audience that we're speaking to. Because if it was a primarily Jewish audience, instead of saying they praise the God of Israel, they would in all likelihood say they praise God. But Matthew specifically says they praise the God of Israel, the God that we know, and the God that was probably foreign to them. But the purpose of miracles was to what? Draw attention to Jesus, draw attention to his ministry, prove that he was who he said he was, prove that his words were God's words, and that God would get the honor. God would get the glory. And that's exactly what happens here. They're praising the God of Israel. It's also, I guess, in stark contrast to the way the Jewish leaders received Jesus, because most of the time the Jewish leaders rejected him. They said that whatever he did was trickery. They even accused him of being a servant of the devil. Anything that they could do to disparage Jesus, they would do. And yet these foreigners, they praise the God of Israel because they recognize what he's doing and that it is impressive. And we should be impressed too. These folks, they stuck out there and listened to him. Would you guys listen to me for 3 days? Solid. If I was doing miracles, maybe. Yeah. I mean, this is amazing, isn't it? These folks were coming from all over the place, and they are sticking with Jesus for 3 days. That says a lot about their dedication. It says a lot about their willingness to listen to the Word of God, because most of us would not tolerate that. Most of us, after about an hour, we're getting kind of antsy. You know, it's like, okay, Blake, you can wrap it up now, you know, right? No, probably not. Most of the time, when you get involved in a sermon, you're like, okay, it's over? Really, it's over? But 3 days? I don't know about that. But you've got to be impressed by the Gentile audience and a Jewish teacher, and they stick with him for 3 days. Jesus is moved by this too. Matthew says he is moved with compassion for this crowd. And so he tells his disciples, I want to feed them. They've been with me now for 3 days. Anything that they had, and you can imagine if they planned on sticking around for a little while, they probably brought a picnic lunch with them. You know? But that was gone a while ago. 3 days. They didn't pack 3 days worth of food. And so by this time, they're all running out of food. And Jesus says, I don't want them to faint on the way. Some of them, Mark adds, live a long ways away. They've got a far distance to travel. I don't want that to happen. We can't have that happening. So we need to feed them. So his disciples, they don't argue with the fact that they need to be fed. But they say, well, Jesus, this is such a remote place. How can we possibly go to any little store and find enough bread to feed 4,000 people? All this huge crowd. How can we possibly find that? Now you got to wonder, I do anyway, where was their memory? It's not been so long ago. Jesus fed 5,000 men plus women and children. Why didn't their little brains go ding, 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 ding? Jesus can handle this. But they didn't. How soon we forget. Yeah, instead, they're worried about scrambling around finding food. So as opposed to using their brains and remembering that Jesus had done this kind of thing already, they're saying, well, there's no way that we can find this kind of food in this remote place. Some have suggested that maybe feeding the Gentiles was something Jesus wouldn't do. And maybe they were thinking that. Some thought that, well, maybe the disciples thought, well, he did that one time, he's not going to do that again. But he's certainly done other things a second or third time. I mean, he heals people all the time, regardless of what it was. Or maybe they just plain forgot. I think, too, this was a test of the disciples. I think Jesus was giving them a test. Not only was he compassionate for this crowd, not only was he moved with concern that they would safely get home, but they would also be impressed by this miracle. But I think it's a test of his disciples. So we asked them, well, how many loaves do you have? And they said 7, and a few small fish. Now, in Mark's account, they just say 7 loaves. And then later, they mention the few small fish. But right up front in Matthew's account, we have 7 and a few small fish. Well, Jesus takes over then. It says, depending on your translation, he told the crowd to sit on the ground, or he directed them to sit on the ground, or he ordered them to sit on the ground. Then he takes the 7 loaves and the few small fish, he blesses them, he breaks them, he hands to his disciples. Now, if you're like the second or third disciple, don't you think you'd be wondering, where's he getting this food? If they don't remember, I mean, he's just continually handing out, and they're in turn turning around and handing to the crowd this bread and fish. After about the second or third, those 7 loaves should have been gone. Those few small fish should have been gone, and yet he keeps handing food. And what's the result? Everyone ate. Everyone was satisfied. You know, it's one thing when they, you know, things, you got the potluck going on and not too many people brought food. And so you ask everybody to kind of go light the first time. You go light the first time. You know, if there's anything left, then you have seconds. But go light the first time. Jesus didn't say that. He just kept handing out food. And everybody ate until they were satisfied. Not only did everybody eat until they were satisfied, but when they're done, Jesus says, okay, pick up the leftovers. You see, God's blessings are great, but God's blessings are not to be squandered. He's not going to throw this food out. He's not just going to throw this food on the ground. What's he going to do? It's to-go baskets. Of course. That's the best thing about a potluck, right? When it's over, you get the leftovers and you share them out. Hey, anybody want some, you know, this? Anybody want some of this? That way you go home with an empty dish, or you got a mixture of stuff from other people, right? Yeah. You don't squander God's blessings. You don't throw it away. What'd they end up with? Well, they ended up with a lot. They picked up 7 baskets full of broken pieces that were left over. And this basket in Matthew chapter 15, the one we're talking about right now, was a large hamper. You know, sometimes you think of baskets as kind of like a picnic basket. No, this word is the same word that is used for the basket that the Lord Paul over the wall in Acts. That's the same hamper, you know, or the same basket. This is like a heavy-duty basket we're talking here, and 7 of them full. That's a lot. And he only started out with seven loaves and a few small fish. They all ate. They were all satisfied. The number of people who ate were 4,000 men, besides women and children. All ate. All were satisfied. All were fed. 4,000 men and women. Men. Then there were women and children. There were probably at least as many women as there were kids. Maybe more women than there were men. And maybe more kids than there were women. I don't know. But the number, at least in my brain, if they started out with 4,000 men, there were probably at least 12,000 people that ate. Just simple math. You know, if you give a couple of kids to some of these families, I mean, Jesus' family, what were there, like 5 boys and 2 or more girls? I mean, they could have had a lot of kids there. There's no telling what size this crowd really was. But they all were satisfied. They all got plenty to eat, and there were leftovers. And the leftovers were picked up. And my personal guess is there were to-go boxes that were handed out for that, because you didn't want to waste it. Then it says after that Jesus sent the crowd away. That's a little bit different than what happened when he fed 5,000, because when he fed 5,000, according to John, the crowd was ready to make him king. And they were in the process of making that move to make Jesus king forcibly against his own will when he had to sneak away. But in this case, he sends the crowd away. And after he sends the crowd away, he gets in a boat and he leaves. Matthew's account doesn't even mention the disciples. You don't really know that they're there. But Mark's account says he got in the boat with his disciples and they took off. Now, in Matthew's account, it says that they went to the vicinity of Magadan. Magadan is something that we do not know about, we've never heard about, they've never discovered, they've never undug anything, they don't know where it is. They sort of think, though, because they describe Jesus coming back across to the east side again, that perhaps it is on the west side of the Sea of Galilee. Maybe around the vicinity of Gennesaret. Mark doesn't use this. Oh, and before I leave that one, there are some people that think it is an alternative spelling of Magdala. And if it was an alternative spelling of Magdala, then it would be where Mary Magdalene came from, because we don't know where that place is either. But there's no real evidence to support that that's the case. However, a later Greek edition actually has inserted Magdala there. But because it is a later edition, It's not considered as reliable as an early edition would be, which has Magadan. But Mark's account says that they went to the region of Dalmanutha, I think, Dalmanutha. And guess what? We don't know where it is. We don't know anything about it. We've never dug up anything on it. But we think, just like Magadan, that it's probably in that vicinity of Gennesaret. Small towns often had two different names. This could be the case that Mark has a name probably geared toward his Roman audience. Matthew has a name probably geared toward his Jewish audience for the same town. That could be. Although, they could be two little towns in the same vicinity of each other in that region on the west side of Galilee. Does it matter? No, not really. But it's one of those things where people like to point at it and they say, the Bible made a mistake. Look at that. One of them says he went to Magadan. The other one says he went to this Dalmanutha. Which is it? Well, it could be both. He went to the region. It says region anyway, right? On both accounts. Went to the region of. Went to the vicinity of, depending on your translation. Does it matter? I don't think so. I think they're probably both small towns, or they may be the same town on the western side of the Sea of Galilee. Well, people like to argue about things in the Bible, and one of the things that they will say too is that this feeding of the 4,000, it's really just a feeding of the 5,000 that's being recounted again. But you know what? That doesn't make good sense. It doesn't make good sense on a lot of different levels, and so I put a little table on your sheet there, and I went ahead and filled in the 5,000 part for you, but I figured you could fill in the 4,000 part, and you'll see that it's different. First off, some of the miracles are contained in all four Gospels. Very, very, very few. Very few. This is one of the biggies. The feeding of 5,000, it's contained in all four Gospels. Each Gospel gives an account of the feeding of the 5,000. Is that significant? I don't know. Maybe it is. There are only two Gospels, though, that have an account of the feeding of 4,000, and that's Matthew and Mark. Why did the others not do it? I don't know. John specifically says in his Gospel, I'm not telling you everything. As a matter of fact, at the end, he says, if we wrote it all down, the books that would be written there's no library around that could hold them all. Jesus did tons and tons and tons of stuff we can't talk about. But what I am giving you, John's limited gospel, he says, what I am giving you is enough to convince you that Jesus is Messiah. That's all you need. So John he's telling you right up front, I'm being pretty succinct here. I'm not getting it all. I'm getting the important stuff. I'm getting the stuff that is enough to convince you that Jesus is Messiah. That's all you need. So he didn't feel like this one was necessary. He didn't include it. Luke didn't either, and Luke is actually the thickest gospel of all of them. But he didn't include this one. But that's something to ponder on your own. The audience. The feeding of the 5,000 was around Bethsaida. So it's up in Galilee, up at the top of the Sea of Galilee, whereas Decapolis is down on the southeastern portion of the Sea of Galilee. Primary audience for the feeding of the 4,000, as I've said a couple times already, is Gentile. These are not Jewish people. There may be a few in the crowd, and certainly the disciples were Jewish, but the primary audience here is Gentile. The location, as I just said, Sea of Galilee near Bethsaida is the location of the feeding of the 5,000, so it's way north of where we are right now in the region of Decapolis, which is a decidedly Gentile region. So for the location, the Decapolis, the region of Decapolis. The initial supply. Now, if you remember in the feeding of the 5,000, the disciples didn't have anything. This was a time when Jesus had snuck off on his own, and they had followed him, and then the crowd followed him too. He preached to them that day, and when he got done, he wanted to feed them. And he looks at his disciples, and they're like, we got nothing. And according to John's gospel, Andrew went out and found this little kid in the audience, and this little kid had what? 5 loaves and 2 fish. So Andrew brings this little kid up to Jesus and said, hey, I found a kid out there that had his lunch. He's the only one that came prepared. Nobody else out here has got anything, but this little kid's got this. So Jesus takes 5 loaves, 2 fish, and he feeds 5,000 people. What happens here? Well, in this particular case, apparently the disciples had 7 loaves and a few small fish. How many fish? I don't know. But it's a different start, and it's stuff they had. Not something they had to get from the audience. They didn't have to raid a little kid's lunchbox or lunch bag or picnic basket or whatever he had, But on the 5,000, they did. In both cases, feeding of the 5,000, feeding of the 4,000, everybody was fed, everybody was satisfied, and there were leftovers. But there again, there's a difference. The leftovers for the feeding of 5,000, more than 12 baskets full. Most people feel like that 12 is a number that represents completion as far as the Jews were concerned. There were 12 tribes. There were 12 apostles. There's 12 baskets. These are picnic baskets. Remember what I said about the 4,000? Yeah. These are 12 picnic baskets full of leftovers. And you know what a picnic basket is, right? All right. So it's a wicker basket, picnic size, 12 of them left over. What was left over the feeding of the 4,000? 7, a number that most commentators think is kind of completion or perfect number as far as the Gentiles are concerned. But these are hamper-sized baskets. These are baskets big enough you could put Paul in and lower him down a wall. This is not a picnic basket. So when you get said and done with it, what you have on the one and what you have on the other may be identical as far as the amount of leftover, but there's a difference. 12 picnic baskets, 7 large hamper baskets full of leftovers. Time of the year. Feeding of the 5,000, Jesus orders the crowd to go sit on the grass. In the springtime, there was grass. But now he says, go sit on the ground. Why? Because there's probably not any grass. Most people feel like this is a couple months later, maybe several months later, into the summertime or into the fall when the ground would, the grass would be scorched or just burned up altogether. Not even there. Sitting on the ground, not sitting on the grass. The time of day, or the time rather with Jesus. In the feeding of the 5,000, as I said earlier, it was a time when Jesus snuck away. His disciples followed him. The crowd followed them. They were with him one day. But on this particular occasion, when he goes to the Decapolis, these folks stick around and listen to him and watch him for 3 days. 3 days of healing, 3 days of teaching, 3 days of inspiring his audience. 3 days. A lot of difference. 1 day, 3 days. A lot of difference. And the response of the crowd. And I mentioned this earlier too, in John chapter 6, right at the tail end of that account, the crowd has this mindset that we're going to make him king. Like it or not, we're going to make him king. And Jesus has to sneak away. He has to sneak away from that crowd because that's not the plan. His plan is not to be an earthly king. His plan is not to be put in power. So he sneaks away. In this account of 4,000, what happens? Well, Jesus simply dismisses the crowd. He tells them it's time to go home. And then he and his disciples get in the boat and they leave. So, all of these things, I think, clearly lead us to the conclusion these have to be separate events. This is not a case of Matthew and Mark getting mixed up and recounting the first event as the second event. The location is different, the crowd is different, the time is different, the time of year is different, the leftovers are different, the containers for the leftovers are different. But if that's not enough, in Matthew 16 and also in Mark 8, Jesus will ask them about these two things. In Matthew 16, verse 5, when they came across the lake, the disciples forgot to take bread. Be careful, Jesus said to them. Be on your guard against the yeast of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And they looked at each other and they said, is this because we didn't bring bread? Now, that's kind of an oddball deduction, wouldn't you think? that Jesus makes this statement about beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and they say, oh, it's because we didn't bring bread. I don't think I'm tickled by it too. Jesus was aware of their discussion about bringing bread. And he says, oh, you of little faith, why are you talking amongst yourselves about having no bread? Do you still not understand? Don't you remember the 5 loaves and the 5,000? How many basketfuls did you gather up? And in Mark's account, they actually respond, and they tell him, 12. Or the 7 loaves and the 4,000, how many baskets full you gathered up? And in Mark's account, they said 7. You see, Jesus thinks they're 2 separate events. So even if all the things that I pointed out already that are drastically different didn't suffice to show you they're 2 separate events, the fact that Jesus asked about both of them in the same conversation should solidify the fact that they are obviously separate events. How is it you don't understand that I was not talking to you about bread? But be on your guard against the yeast of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Then they understood. They're kind of slow. They're like us sometimes, right? Kind of slow. Then they understood he was not talking to them about guarding against the yeast in bread, but rather the teachings of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. So I know the bell's going to ring before I get to that last one. So I kind of answered that question for you about the spiritual lessons that ought to come from this. The first is traditions of men. That's where this thing started. Washing hands, and Jesus introduced the idea of, well, you're substituting your tradition for God's law. Can't do that. Same true for us. We can have traditions, and traditions are good and they're fine as long as they don't violate God's command. But when we teach our tradition, we need to teach it as our tradition. So if it's violated, it's no big deal. It was our tradition. But we have traditions, some folks get all bent out of shape if you have the Lord's Supper at the end of the service versus the middle of the service. Others get bent out of shape if you have the first of the service versus the end of the service. Why? It's tradition. Doesn't matter. It's our tradition. We were at a congregation one time that got upset because we put the collection on the same table where the implements for the Lord's Supper were. Why? Didn't think money ought to be mixed up with the Lord's Supper. Why? It's a table. It's our tradition. False teachers. Jesus said, every plant that is not planted by my Father will be uprooted. Blind guides will lead the blind. They'll both fall into the ditch. We need to check out who's teaching us. You need to be looking up the things that I'm saying. We need to be looking up the things that Blake's saying. We don't just take it because David said it. We just don't take it because Blake said it. Look it up. Check it out. Did he read it right? Did he take it out of context? Did he apply it right? Did it make sense? Check out who you're following. Impure living. He talks about what proceeds out of the mouth defiles a man, not what somebody takes into their mouth. And he gave a list of things that start in the heart. Evil thoughts, murders, adulteries, fornications, thefts, false witness, slanders, all of that. And then little faith. He used the example of the Syrophoenician woman and the great faith that she had that resulted in her daughter being saved. He also commended the great faith of the centurion and the healing of his servant. He never says that about a Jew. He never said that about his disciples. Most of the time when he talked about his disciples, he said, "O ye of little faith." "O you of little faith," just like he said a minute ago. And then our complex way of living. These people in Decapolis sat around Jesus' feet or stood around Jesus' feet for 3 days and listened to him talk about God's will. Most of us are not willing because of our life, because of the things in our life, because of things going around, to dedicate an afternoon or to dedicate a day or to dedicate a couple hours to studying God's Word. Our complex life can get in the way of our serving God, and we need to be aware of that. All righty. Next week, we are going to talk about Jesus promising to build his church. And that's it, found in Matthew chapter 16. Thank you very much for your attention today. We'll pick up again next week.